Here are some general essay tips that I have. These are true not just for this class, but really for any academic writing. I definitely recommend using headings. Some might want to delete them, especially if you need to save space, but use headings to really help yourself structure what you're going to write. So only write information that is directly relevant to the heading that it falls under. Just because you use headings does not mean that you don't need to use transition sentences. Make sure you use transition sentences between paragraphs, even if it goes through a heading. Students should really try to avoid anthropomorphisms. I'm not going to take marks off of your papers, or your TAs aren't going to take marks off of your papers for using anthropomorphisms, but it's a writing habit that students should try to avoid. An anthropomorphism involves giving a human quality to a non-human entity. So as an example, an anthropomorphism would be if you were to write, this paper will examine how psychopathy applies to Clifford Olson. This is an anthropomorphism because the paper cannot do anything. The paper cannot apply a theory. The paper cannot seek to understand. Only you are the one that is seeking to understand or apply this theoretical perspective. So it's okay to use terms like I in your paper. Although it's okay to use terms like I really recommend to you that you never use terms like we, you, us, or one. Students love to say things like, as one can see, psychopathy applied to Edmund Kemper. Don't make inferences or assumptions that your reader definitely agrees with you. So avoid referring to the reader in your paper. You don't want to say things like, as we can see, or as we all know. One of the good ways of preparing for submitting your paper is proofreading your paper out loud. When you're sitting at your computer late at night and you're skimming through your paper looking for spelling mistakes, grammar mistakes, and so on, eyes in your brain will try and just gloss over entire sentences. When you say things out loud, it's much easier to detect if there is a mistake in your sentence. It can also help you identify when you're using language incorrectly. I find that when we're writing, we can use language that we would never use if we were actually having a conversation with a person. If you would not say these terms to a person, or if you would not use this phrasing if you're talking to your mom or your dad or whomever, don't use them in your paper. One of the myths of writing papers is the idea that we have to use very colorful language, use jargon, use a thesaurus to say things in the most complicated way because we're now in university and we have to have a higher standard of writing. This is a completely backwards way of thinking. The goal for writing should always be to communicate your thoughts to as many people as possible. Make your writing as easily understood to the greatest amount of people. So you don't need to try and impress anybody by using words that could be really simplified. Also try to say things in fewer words. Really read through your paper to find ways to say things in simpler ways. When it comes to references, we'll have a little tutorial discussion as well on how to how to cite sources and so on. And I'll talk a little bit about that today as well. But one thing I will say for this class is that you do need to cite your sources all the time, but I recommend never using quotes. Always paraphrase things and then use an in-text citation. When you string together quotes, it's actually a form of patch writing. If you just take one quote and then add a but or an and then add another quote, this is also a form of patch writing, and it can be considered plagiarism, and it can result in getting a 0 on the term project. In some cases, it can even result in students failing the course. Another thing is to not use colloquialisms or cliches or social commentary. Don't say things like Clifford Olson's crimes shocked society. He murdered children. It's obvious that these crimes are horrific. You don't need to use colorful, flowery language. You don't need to refer to readers. You don't need to try and make the offenses sound exciting. This is why I tend to not like true crime documentaries, because those that are presenting the information are trying to sell entertainment. And it's not that I don't like true crime documentaries, it's just I don't like them for teaching us about how to talk about offending in academic writing. If you aren't sure if you're using a colloquialism or a cliche, just ask. Just reach out to me or your TA and send the passage in question and say, like, is this colloquial language? Don't say things like, since the dawn of time, people have been trying to understand crime. You don't need these broad colloquial generalizations. I've never taken marks off of a student's paper for providing too many in-text citations. Anytime you're referring to the work of others, you need to provide an in-text citation. If you have multiple passages or sentences to write about a given person's work, provide the in-text citation for each new idea that person presented. Try to be careful with your use of pronouns. So if you're talking about an author that was writing about a particular case and you use a term they, the reader might not be sure if you're referring to the author or the case that the author was writing about. So the next part of today's talk is going to focus on how we actually read and understand empirical articles. And the reason why I want to focus on empirical articles is because textbook chapters are tending to be too broad and provide just a general overview of information on the topic. We don't necessarily, they'll talk about a theory, but they won't tell you whether the theory is valid. How long have textbooks been talking about Freud's psychodynamic perspective, but not mentioning the fact that empirical articles tend to not support this perspective? Or they've been talking about the Stanford prison experiment, but not mentioning all of the studies that have been found that have shown that the study was conducted unethically, that Zimbardo lied about a lot of the research that he was doing, and so on. Empirical articles are valuable because they address a very specific topic and they're a little bit more narrow, but they give us a lot of more detailed information on the topic that we are interested in. And I think that for especially first and second year students, it can be kind of frustrating in these first year classes when you're reading textbooks, because you might find a topic that you absolutely love and the textbook will talk about it for like 2 paragraphs out of the 200 pages that the textbook is in length. Empirical articles are useful because they can give you some more detailed information about the topic that you're interested in. We need empirical articles for several reasons. One is to build ideas and develop theories from our findings. So especially for poorly understood or rarely examined phenomenon, this is a way to develop theories about these rare events. And this is typically associated with qualitative research. So the empirical articles are there for theory building. On the other hand, quantitative research is there to help validate or test theories. What if our theory, which we want to use to inform criminal justice system policy, is actually inaccurate? These empirical studies make sure that we are using evidence-based practices in day-to-day life in the justice system. When we're looking at articles in the social sciences that are empirical, basically all of them follow the same format, where there's a lit review that's talking about what is known and not known about the topic, identifying the gap in the literature that this paper is going to address. The method will talk about sample, procedures, measures, and analytic strategy. The results section is going to talk about what was found from the statistical analyses conducted by the authors. And then the discussion section makes sense of the results, puts them into context of other literature, and talks about the limitations of the paper and future research. When you are reading a paper, here are 6 questions that you'll want to answer. And below each question is where you can find that piece of information. So I won't read everything out to you, but just putting this up there for your own sort of reference if you want to use it as a guide or as a way to make notes, was a way to find the key information that you want from each paper. My goal is to show students how to basically apply a formula to their reading of an empirical article. And by using this formula, you can really begin to understand topics that you had no prior understanding of. The reason why I selected this article was I wanted to show students that I can take a topic that I really know nothing about, and I can begin to make sense of and understand the article. And there are thousands of topics that I know nothing about, so why did I select this one? Well, I selected this one specifically because one of the authors, whose name is Natalie Hirschlag, some of you might actually know her better as Natalie Portman, who wrote this article with her supervisor, I believe it was Jerome Kagan, when she was a graduate student at Harvard. So how do we find this article? Here is one of the things that I think will be very useful for you to know, not just in this class, but throughout your degree. Journals have moved towards making a lot of their articles more accessible. So what I'm about to say, you might not even need to do anymore because you can just very easily get all articles for free. But what I want to show you is how to get articles from Google Scholar for free. So the first thing that you're going to do is go into Google and type in the SFU off-campus bookmarklet, and then go to the very first tab that will give you instructions on how to set up the bookmarklet. Basically, find the internet browser that you use and follow the instructions for saving the bookmarklet to your favorites. So for Google Chrome, I literally just take this and drag it up here to my bookmarks bar. Then what you can do is type in the name of the article into Google Scholar. So go to scholar.google.ca and you can click on the article, and in this case, it's actually going to go straight to the article for free. So this is, I think, because the journal has moved to more open access of all articles during the pandemic. But what you might find is that some articles you'll come across will not allow you to download them for free. You'll get this lockbox that says that the article is locked and you can't download the PDF. Click on that SFU off-campus bookmarklet in your favorites bar and you'll be asked to sign in. So enter your username and password, click sign in, and now you'll see that the PDF is available. So you can click download PDF and there you go. Now you've got that article that you can download, save to your computer, anything like that. So now that we're all able to access the article, I'll go through and show you where you find all of the information that you want to know. So recall those different questions that I had listed in one of the PowerPoint slides. We'll go and address each of them. So when it comes to the research question, you can often find this question specified directly in the abstract. So I've got screenshots of the article here, and you can see that in the abstract they talk about how methodological and ethical constraints have made it difficult to collect neuropsychological evidence from awake behaving infants. And so here in this study, they're going to use near-infrared spectroscopy to provide a non-invasive way of basically detecting hemoglobin levels within an individual. What they're saying is that they're looking at this non-invasive technique where they actually, it sounds invasive, but they're shining a laser into a kid's brain to detect hemoglobin levels. Whereas in the past, they would have to put on like this helmet, an fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, to look at brain functioning. So you can find that information in the abstract. If you don't find the research question specified in the abstract, often it can be presented at the end of the paper's introduction section. So you can see this very clearly in the Natalie Portman paper where they say the present study sought to use NIRS or near infrared spectroscopy to monitor the activity of the frontal cortex as indexed by the hemodynamic response prior to and following the emergence of object permanence. The sample is basically the first subsection in the method section. In this case, like when they do experiments, sometimes they call it subjects, sometimes it might be called participants or data, but I like to refer to it as sample because I think that's the most common term used in the social sciences. So what you're looking for when we're describing the sample is how many and who. So here we have 12, so that's the answer of how many, and then who is healthy full-term infants. We can see 6 females, 6 males, observed initially at 5 months of age and then followed longitudinally for about 12 months. Sometimes procedures come before measures and vice versa. Usually procedures comes before measures. Procedures describes how the data were collected, and then measures describes what was actually measured, how the authors operationalized their key terms. So for procedures, you're looking for a description of how the study was conducted, how are people interviewed and assessed. So we've got here, they're talking about how they used an EEG basically to measure what was going on in the brain. And then what they were looking at for the infants was whether they showed object permanence. The object permanence test, if you don't really know about it, it's why peekaboo is like the best game for kids. or not kids, but infants or toddlers. When something disappears from their eyesight, they believe that that object no longer exists. So because they cannot see it, it does not exist. So somebody is there, then they put a blanket in front of them, in front of the infant, and they disappear, and then they remove the blanket and they're brought back. And this is sort of just entertainment for the kid for seeing something disappear, so they don't think that it existed anymore, and now it's back, and it's crazy, it's amazing. So measures is basically describing how the researchers operationalize their key variables. So it's talking about how the NIRS system was used to investigate levels of hemoglobin in the brain, and basically they used 2 low power laser diodes to emit light, and this helped detect levels of hemoglobin. When it comes to the analytic strategy subsection and the results subsection of a paper, certainly feel free to attempt to read these sections and begin to understand them, but they're not necessary to read for this class. They'll be describing the results in very technical terms, but in the discussion section, the job of the author is to describe the results in more user-friendly terms, ways that are more easily understood or digestible. So the discussion section, usually in the very first paragraph, it will say what the results of the study were, and will explain why the results were important. Also, towards the end of the discussion section, you'll find usually a specific subsection for limitations and future research. You'll typically find limitations written before future research because authors don't like to end their paper on a bad note saying, here are the limitations of my study, the end. Instead, it'll talk about limitations and talk about future research, which is very often ways to address the limitations of this prior work. You don't have to come up with your own limitations that you identified in an author's paper. You can just rely on their limitations section to identify what was wrong with their paper. But if you want, you can feel free to come up with your own limitations that you thought were present in the author's paper. There are fair and unfair critiques, though. Unfair critique is author bias. Just because an author developed a theory doesn't mean that automatically makes them biased in their attempts to validate the theory. Be careful when saying that a paper had a small sample size, because this can be dependent on the type of research being conducted. Things that are more fair to critique are things like if you thought that the authors did not do a good job of operationalizing their key theoretical principles. If you think that the authors failed to include important subgroups, like often criminologists have a history of focusing solely on white males, this is going to limit generalizability. Maybe the authors interpreted their findings in a way that you disagree with, and you can also talk about that as a fair criticism. So, how will you communicate what you've read into your term paper? You want to keep this relatively short. You don't want to be writing 2 pages on what a particular study found. Remember, you've got to write summaries for 4 empirical articles, so you want to be able to write all of this in about 1 paragraph for each of the 4 articles. You want to do basically 8 things in your paragraph. The first is to provide a citation. So in this case, we can write Baird et al. We're able to write Baird et al. Right off the hop because there's more. Now APA rules allow us to, whenever you have 3 authors or more, the first time you use that citation, you can go right to name the first author and then write et al. Then you're going to specify their research question. Baird et al. Examined whether near-infrared spectroscopy could be used to detect frontal cortex activity before and after object permanence. Then you're going to describe the sample in your study. When describing the sample, you can talk about both male and female persons were included. And then where you see that n equals 6, that indicates the sample size for the subgroups. So again, be nice and efficient with your writing. We can even describe the procedures and measures simultaneously. So 2 lasers were used to detect frontal cortex activity. Then the results. The authors concluded that frontal cortex activity was reliably detected using NIRS technology. And then we can specify limitations. One of the limitations was that only 1 region of the brain was examined. Another was that long-term follow-up data were unavailable. And then finally, for future research, we can again throw in a citation there. Baird et al. Recommended examining additional regions of the brain over a longer developmental period with repeated measures or more observations more frequently. So again, this is basically the future research is just addressing the limitations that were specified by the authors. So that's everything for now. We will talk in tutorial discussions. Your TAs will provide you with some guidelines about how to cite your sources, and we'll do a little bit more of a deep dive into Google Scholar and how I think this is the best resource for students to use when researching their papers.
I think I'll go home and mull this over for a crown it down my throat. At long last it's crashed, it's collapsed.